people are fighting on airplanes because of systematic racism that set them back in terms of poverty and everything? Or do you think that that's the truth because there's something in the soul of a black person that just makes them violent, which I think a lot of people would find that to be the offensive explanation. And most people would assume you to have that opinion, right?
Well, I wouldn't say it's your soul, but when we're talking about behavior, the question is you've got these behaviors, criminality, and if you want to say pugilism, fighting is a behavior. And so the question would be if black people are behaving in a different way than white people generally, why is that? What would you attribute that to? And the explanation for all of it, all the disparities between blacks and white people, liberals say is injustice. It's racism, it's bigotry, because they assume that white people and black people in a vacuum are going to behave exactly the same, perform exactly the same, have the same capacity and faculties and so on. And so if they wind up in a different place, well, something had to happen in the middle, which was discrimination, racism. They were brought up the wrong way, educated the wrong way. And I would say that it's wrong to assume that behavior is not genetic. Behavior, as we know, is genetic. Sociopathy, antisocial behavior, there is a strong heritability for those kinds of things. And so there's a lot of different hypotheses about, what gene is it necessarily or whatever, but we do know that antisocial behavior is genetic. Can it also be environmental? Certainly. But we also know that people have a temperament. Some people, it's just not in their temperament to fight. Would you say that's because they were taught that? We all know, because children, some children like to fight. Some children don't. Is it because they were taught that? Sometimes it's brothers and sisters by the same parents in the same school, have a different nature. And we could say nature is said another way. They have a different genetic makeup. And so I would say that, I think that why do blacks commit 60%? It's 2021. It was actually 60%, not 50. Why do they commit 60% of the violent crime? I think because there is a genetic basis for their behavior. Africans lived in Africa for thousands and thousands of years without a lot of mixing with people on other continents.
So, I wanted to address this. To me, I agree, but I think there's misunderstanding because a lot of things about Black Americans is hidden, and then people don't want to address it because of the whole idea of Black people's race. The whole idea of Black people's race was encouraged to be seen a certain way for labor costs, but not specifically because of the reality of the situation. It was used for labor purposes, and why Black Americans are specifically seen as Black American, as seen as specifically racially the same as African people. Now, you can look at statistics, and you can see that for African people do much better at academics than white Americans or Black Americans for that matter. Economically, they're doing a lot better than Black Americans. When it comes to criminality, they are also doing better. So it seems like on those issues, they aren't negatively affected. Now, we can look at this on the basis of Black Americans and the people of specific countries that come from the specific countries that Black Americans' ancestors came from, specifically like Nigerians, for example. Nigerians, for example, have great stats on education, on economics, and when it comes to the penal system. So they are not having as much issue with the whole criminality of the situation. And when you're saying about violent crimes, they are not the main ones committing violent crimes. So to me, it's like, I don't think that this is specifically having to do with the Black race. But you could say that for Black Americans, it does have to do with their race. Definitely does have to do with their race, in my opinion, because Black Americans are the ones who, if you look at the history of Black Americans, there's a lot of things that are really shameful that happened in Black Americans' history that nobody can talk about because we don't even acknowledge that's what they are, basically. So Black Americans, for example, are on average 25% white ancestry. So when you talk about racial mixing, this is a big important part of Black Americans. Black Americans are the product of racial mixing. Black Americans are literally, on average, a combination of a black parent and a mixed race mulatto parent. And in some cases, on the higher end, you can find some Black Americans who will be more like a multi-generational mulatto plus a full Black American, where they basically inherit less of their multi-generational mulatto ancestor. So it varies like that. And then there's some people who vary more into the mulatto range. But on average, most Black Americans are basically a Black person, a full African, Black African, plus a mulatto. That's what they on average are. Now, the way Black Americans inherited their white ancestry specifically is very important to antisocial personality disorder. Specifically, Black Americans inherit their white ancestry from white slave owners who raped African female slaves, women. Sometimes it wasn't women, though. It was sometimes children. That's why I'd rather say female, because many of the time it was girls who were raped and gave birth to children that were the product of rape of their slave owners, their white, antisocial personality disordered slave owners, basically. So these people basically had children with antisocial psychopaths who lived on torturing people. They were specifically, because you have to understand what a slave owner was. They were specifically somebody who was good at torturing people, destroying people from birth to grave. This is the type of person who was a slave owner. This was a type of person who was involved in slavery, basically, because it wasn't always slave owners that impregnated African Black women and girls. Sometimes it was also like the people that worked for slave owners, basically, who really were they were basically involved in the torture of Black slaves, basically. So anyway, these people's gene pool contribute to a quarter of Black Americans' genes. A quarter. And many of the time, it's much more than that, because the average Black American is 73% Black, so that means it's slightly above a quarter, and then some people are above that percentage. So anyway, knowing this lets you know that Black Americans will obviously have tendencies for antisocial personality disorder. And it's weird that people never talk about this. They never talk about it with Black Americans, as if Black Americans are supposed to have all these things happen to them. And then they're supposed to just wake up one day and become, pristine individuals, when their ancestors were not pristine individuals. They were just people who were able to commit so much violence against another people, and it was completely legal. They could kill slaves, and they regularly did kill slaves. And they could, commit so much violence, and it would be tolerated. So they lived in a society, their forefathers lived in a society where violence was okay in the specific situation that they were in, and this is why they were perfect for the job of being a slave owner, being a slave driver, being a person who was basically going to involve themselves in the torture of slaves, basically. And so what Black Americans have the problem of is having the genes of slave owners who were encouraged to be violent. And for their lifestyle, it was conducive for them to have a very violent nature, basically, because that's what they lived off. That's what their money depended on, was them being a very ruthless, devilish individual against other people, dehumanizing other people, having the ability to easily dehumanize people, for that matter, and for them to extrapolate that to their children are going to have a hard time being in society that way. Think of it. Think of a slave owner being in today's society. Do you think a slave owner in today's society is going to be a person who is going to stay out of jail, stay out of having problems with the law, when they, in their natural habitat, are a very violent individual? And so when they are in an environment where they have to be civilized, it is impossible for them to continue to have that civilized mentality. Most of the time with psychopaths and antisocial personality disordered individuals, they can wear a mask and pretend they are civilized around certain people as long as they can have a certain population of people that they can torture, because they need to be able to torture people because that's their nature, period. So that's why Black Americans have this predicament and Africans don't, because Black Americans have this situation where, one, people try to act like, with rape and incest, and people who are the product of rape and incest, people always know that the child might have a tendency to gravitate towards antisocial personality disorder. Now, there's two things about this with Black Americans that makes it even worse of a situation. It is not just one lineage that you can trace your ancestor back to slavery. I will tell you, I do not have 25% European in me. I only have 8.9%. I can trace European ancestry down pretty much any line that I so choose, because it's just rampant in our ancestry, basically. So it's not just coming from one person, it comes from many different lines over many different generations. So basically, think of it. If in your gene pool you just constantly have many different people contributing to your family line and your heritage and your genes that are antisocial psychopaths who, by the reason they're even in your gene pool, is because of rape, because of their ruthless, satanic, psychopathic behavior. That's the only reason they're even in your gene pool. How do you think that the people with that gene pool are going to actually act in society? Of course, when it is such a big portion of your DNA that is 25%, and everyone in your family line is 25% of a serial killing, psychopathic, serial rapist, and it's so many different people, it's not just one monster, you have many different monsters in your family, then of course you're going to have a tendency towards antisocial personality disorder traits. And that's why you're going to have psychopathic traits. You're going to have more psychopaths. You're going to have more violent people. You're going to have more problems. And you're going to have more of these people commit violent crimes. You have to pay attention to another thing here. If you look at slave owners in the past, in our history, the main violent individuals out of those families, though there were females that were very violent, were the males. This is very important to notice, because if you look at Black people, the main people that are in jail of Black people are Black men. It's not Black women. Black women only overrepresent themselves 1.5% of their population. So 1.5 times their population. Black men overrepresent themselves 3.5 times their population, and sometimes they approach 4 times. It makes sense. It's almost like they're just definitely, like they're like basically representations of their ancestors, of the past, of their slave-owning family populations, where they have that violent streak, and it shows more prominently in the men than the women, basically. And it's like the men are more strongly aggressive, and you have to understand with psychopathic behavior and antisocial personality disorder, it is usually more violent and more violently expressed in men than women. And also, it is more likely that men are more likely to have propensities towards antisocial personality disorder. So, being the descendants of slaves and being the descendants of slave owners has shaped Black Americans into having qualities that are more in common with antisocial personality psychopaths, because in their family, at 1 out of 4 of their family ancestors in their family were psychopathic, crazy, sadistic individuals who were serial rapists and serial killers. They were just legalized. So, with this being the case, of course, Black Americans display exactly what their fathers were and what their ancestors were, especially that's one of the issues, like I said, being the product of rape several times over. Because if you really pay attention to it during slavery, considering that Black Americans are 3/4, pretty much less than 3/4 Black, that means that of fatherhood during slavery, 52 to 54% of the time, the fathers were white psychopathic serial killers. So that is a big portion. That is the majority of fathers during slavery were white slave owners, not Black African slaves. And this is important to recognize because it lets you know what kind of environment Black Americans were raised in. Think of it. If you were raised by a psychopathic parent, it's going to be more likely that you're going to display those psychopathic traits. If that psychopathic parent is not even abusing you, for that matter. Now, if that psychopathic parent is raising you, is the only one in power, because the slave owner was the only one in power, and is molding you by destroying you, by torturing you in every way possible, then that person is very likely to become a psychopath. We all know that psychopaths are more likely to occur when they're raised in a very dangerous environment and nurtured that way. And we all know that during slavery, Black Americans were very much nurtured into being very hardcore psychopaths because of their environment and because of their genetics. So to me, it's not specifically that Black Americans are that way because of race. It on the basis of being Black, I think it's actually their white ancestry that makes them that way. Because you can look at Africans and that's not the situation that they're dealing with. It's only Black Americans that have this problem, and that's because of the racial mixing of white slave owners who were maniacal and psychopathic and raped Black women and made it this way, basically. So that's why Black Americans struggle with psychopathic traits. It's not based on race, like based on being Black. It's based on the fact that they descend from slave owners and that over 50% of the paternal lines for Black Americans lead back to a white slave owner who was a psychopath who raped women. So he was clearly a very violent criminal who was just let loose on society because he basically channeled his hate and his anger and all of his violence to Black people, Black slaves, so then he could get away with it legally. And I think a lot of psychopaths did that. You could see a lot of different types of people channeled a lot of their basically societal abnorms onto Black people during slavery, because that was the population you could channel all your abnormalities and your sadistic behavior and your deviance onto Black people who were slaves because nobody cared about them. So that is more the importance, I think, when we talk about slavery and we talk about Black Americans and the differences and the fact that they commit 60% of the violent crimes, 40% of Black men account for 40% of the prisons in America these days. And that's because of the situation of descending from slave owners. I would also like to see how the descendants of slave owners for white people worked out, because a lot of the time we can't see this concept for for white Americans, because they don't consistently procreate with the same population like Black Americans do. Black Black Americans procreated mainly with other Black Americans that were descendants of slaves and slave owners. So it was a constant lineage of overlapping with the same bad genetics of slave owners being input into several different types of people who were the descendants of slaves who were Black. You can't see this quite the same with white Americans who are the descendants of slaves, because many of the time these people ended up having children with other white people who were not the descendants of slave owners. So then what happens is their genes get diluted while Black Americans don't. So, it's so many different layers to this that I feel like you can't really compare it, but you can see where it came from, because you can see the behavior of slave owners and see that obviously their behavior was violent. Obviously they had psychopathic tendencies, sadistic tendencies. Obviously they were people with antisocial personality disorder as their personal mental illness and their personal struggle. You can tell that they had these traits because of their behaviors that they express, and their mindset towards Black people was to dehumanize them, to use humans for your own personal gain. That is a psychopathic trait in itself. Manipulation, so forth. All these traits had to do with slave owners and how they basically ran their plantations. So that's what I think people need to focus on. Thanks for watching, everyone. Like and subscribe, comment down below, and have a great day. Bye, guys.